Greetings, and welcome to this edition of Fuel for Talks. I'm your host, Guido Vildozo, Associate Director of Consulting at S&P Global Mobility. In today's episode, we'll discuss how the automotive industry is navigating anticipated shifts under a second Trump administration, particularly with a focus on the global implications of new U.S. tax policies, tariffs, and deregulation. We'll also dive into the uncertain future of electric vehicles, with policy changes leading to a potential significant slowdown in adoption rates. How the automotive industry adapts to these changes will be key in determining the pace of EV growth globally. From North America to Europe and China, the auto industry is poised for significant challenges, but also some opportunities in 2025. Joining me today are three experts from S&P Global Mobility who are closely following these scenarios. Peter Nagle, Research and Analysis Associate Director. Stephanie Brinley, Associate Director, AutoIntelligence. Michael Robinet, Executive Director, Consulting. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here today. Let me get started by asking, when we talk about tariffs, Peter, one of the first policy shifts that could impact the automotive industry is the introduction of new tariffs on vehicles from regions like Japan, Korea, and Europe. What do you anticipate will be the immediate effects of these proposed tariffs on the U.S. auto market and vehicle prices?
Yeah, hey Guido, good morning. I'd like to say welcome to everyone for joining us here today as well. I'd probably even back this question up a little bit further because I think we're already starting to experience some of the impacts of just the threat of additional tariffs, just the rapid fire nature of some of these policy proposals as they come out, right? First, was it a 10% universal tariff and a 20% tariff? Now we're considering potentially 25% tariffs on top of Canada and Mexico and a 60% tariff or higher on China. Just the rapid fire and sequential nature of these threats breeds a lot of uncertainty, and that causes some consternation when we start to look at auto investments, foreign capital flows, market performance. It just really starts to weigh on the industry even before the tariffs are actually announced or implemented. When we get to the actual implementation point, I'm of an orthodox view here that tariffs are inflationary. So depending on the nature, right, the devil's always in the details and where the products are going to be exempt or not. We start to see those effects. So the U.S. is still relatively insular in its light vehicle market. 55-60% of all vehicles sold in the United States are made in the United States, and almost 80% are made in North America. But that remaining 20% that would be imported, Japan, South Korea, Western Europe, would be subject to a pretty sharp tariff increase. Our common external tariff, the most favored nation tariff, right now is about 2.5%. And depending on where that final policy proposal lands, that would add additional cost at the port of entry here for imports. And then those would likely be passed along to the consumer in some form or fashion. Automakers and dealers could absorb some of that, but in all likelihood, it would result in steep price increases for all imported product. If that starts to include Canada and Mexico, that really gets dramatic because most of the vehicles now qualify for duty-free entry. That really would result in drastic increases in the price. And then we got to think about, again, the implementation, whether or not these are additive tariffs or total tariff value, right? So the 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico as proposed would be equivalent to the chicken tax that's existed in the U.S. light vehicle market since the Eisenhower administration, that 25% tariff on light trucks and commercial vehicles. Mexico's a big hub for pickup production. So whether or not that 25% tariff would be additive on top of the chicken tax or not is still something to be considered and could have an even more dramatic impact once those tariffs are finally went through. The amount of uncertainty, I would say now, is having an impact on how the industry is planning to operate for the next 4 years at least, and maybe even beyond. If they're getting a little bit hesitant about the reliability of U.S. trade policy. And then the tariffs, depending on how they're implemented, what products are included, what countries, where the exemptions are, would have an impact on vehicle cost for the consumer. From a parts trade, completed units trade and interregional trade especially would be a major roadblock to vehicle sales growth here in the short term.
Thank you, Pete. Very insightful. And let's continue rolling on that note and talk about the significant concern on a potential 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico. I remember talking to one of the trade associations and them highlighting that one of the most extreme cases saw a particular good, and this was seatbelts, come back and forth between the US and Mexico 14 different times. Given how integrated the North American automotive supply chain is, how would such a tariff affect global manufacturers and consumers in the region?
Yeah, this is the big threat out there, I would say. Of all the policy proposals, this would be the most disruptive. Because if we just rewind the clock back to the first Trump administration and the negotiations for USMCA, which went into effect in July of 2020, one of the big goals of the then Trump administration was to increase local investment, local production, and they did it through several pillars, right? The local content requirements for the completed unit, higher domestic content for core, principal, and complementary parts, really strong domestic sourcing for steel and aluminum within North America, and then the wage requirements for production here for final assembly rising to at least $16 an hour. We're currently in year 4 of USMCA, and these content requirements have just ratcheted it up sequentially, really every year since 2020. So now that we're looking at almost 75% domestic content requirements for car and light truck, 75% for core parts. So these are things intrinsic to the function of a vehicle, things like auto bodies, suspension system, HVAC systems, steering systems, etc. 70% for principal parts. So these have a strong automotive application, things like batteries, wheels and tires, seating. Seat belts would fall into this category as well. And then even 65% for complementary parts. So things really down the value chain. What this means is North America is more integrated now than ever. Trade flows across the region are up dramatically. U.S. imports from Canada and Mexico since 2019 are up over 20%. Our exports of auto parts to those countries are up over 10%. So that the combined cross-border trade in autos is now approaching $160 billion annually. Just in those core and principal part categories in 2023 alone. You mentioned seatbelts as an example. Again, this would be where the devil is in the details. Is it on the completed value of the product, or is it on the domestic value add component? For some of those well-integrated supply chains, seating, wire harnesses, etc., those could be tariffed multiple times across the border and really would have, again, a disruptive effect, not only because of the higher cost associated with it, but the paperwork, the logistics, everything would slow down, and you'd have added cost there just because of the nature of customs enforcement. So again, I would say it's a dramatic escalation, again, from a pretty well-integrated market with very little tariff barrier. A 25% tariff would be extremely disruptive, not to mention we import almost 25% of completed units from Canada and Mexico. So the U.S. produces and sells about 50 to 60% of its share. The rest would be split pretty evenly between North American imports and then imports from the rest of the world combined. So again, it would have a dramatic escalatory effect on pricing and extremely disruptive to the cohesive nature of the supply chain that's emerged post-USMCA implementation. And again, that 25% tariff tweet is going to need to be fleshed out in its implementation. And really, that is where we'll begin to understand some of the impacts on a tariff line basis.
Thank you for these nuggets, Pete. Much appreciated. Stephanie, let's turn to deregulation and tax cuts, which could have a particular dramatic impact on the pace of EV adoption. Would a second Trump administration focus on deregulation, including loosening fuels economy standards and revising the CO2 emission regulations? How may these changes affect the transition for automakers to electric vehicles, particularly in the U.S.?
Yeah, thank you again. Thank you for having me back on the show. what we're looking at here is if you deregulate what the emissions requirements are, it changes what an automaker is forced to make sure that they can provide. And it reduces the push a little bit to electric vehicles from a manufacturing standpoint. And it then allows a bit more of a consumer pull. Now, automakers are clearly heavily invested in electric vehicles. And in order to look past 2030 and 2032 and further on, you have to have the research and development to be able to support that much further down the line. So you can't not invest in that, but you can let consumer pull a little bit, take a bit more control over that by tax cuts and deregulation. I think it's important to note, too, that for S&P Global Mobility, we were looking at these regulations, and that 2028 to 2032 time period, there were serious concerns that, as written, the auto industry could meet those anyway. So we did expect some level of pullback in the U.S. market and those regulations, regardless of which administration took over the White House. But it will be a little bit different and probably a little more aggressive under the Trump administration. So it affects all that investment. It affects how much and what the mix is that an automaker plans to build. As we look at the tariff conversation that Peter is talking about too, and the integration of the supply chain network, it also is also very difficult for automakers in the sense that it's already integrated, and the decisions of where you're going to build and when you're going to build and where is your plant are hard to change on a fly. So even if the emissions regulations come back down a little bit, there's already investment in being able to meet some of that. So we'll still have a lot of electric vehicles. We'll still have a lot of a focus on that, but it'll change a little bit and I think it puts a little bit more of the control into the consumer's hands to a degree. And automakers will do their best to meet consumer demand and regulations. They've been working with that contradiction and alignment in some cases for decades, and they'll navigate that through. Deregulation makes it both easier and harder, I think. Easier because you can follow consumers, but a little bit harder because you don't know exactly where they're going to go all the time. So I think those are the high points in deregulation and tax cuts.
Great points, and particularly, let's focus on the elephant in the room and thinking about that push and pull that you mentioned earlier. If fuel economy standards are relaxed and environmental regulations are rolled back, how do we see this impacting consumer demand for electric vehicles?
I think that's a great question, and it's one of the interesting dynamics in here. On one level, consumers aren't focused on the economy standards and the environmental regulations. It impacts what's in the showroom, and it impacts what they know about. But consumers aren't necessarily looking at it and saying, oh, the regulation is X in 2030, so that's what I need to buy. They're really focused on what they want and what comes down to them. We are looking at, of course, making a big change. Earlier forecasts, we were looking at about 40% BEV sales in 2030. Now we're looking at about 30%. So there's a big cutback in this. And what drives that cutback and we're reverting a little bit more to consumer pull instead of push is consumers are still learning how to deal with this technology. It is still more expensive than internal combustion engines. And we're in that state of flux. People need to have more experience with it. We need the infrastructure. And when we talk about tax cuts, that's going to affect or has potential to affect some of the infrastructure development relative to charging. And that's a big issue for consumers trying to make this switch, is understanding how many chargers they need, our chargers in places, and then integrating that into their lifestyle. To be honest, if somebody buys an electric vehicle, it can take them a year and a half to fully understand how to make that vehicle work more seamlessly in their lives. And there's a huge learning curve on that. So as the infrastructure develops to make that learning curve a little bit easier, consumers can grow and develop, and their interest in this technology continues to grow, but the hesitance is here right now. And a lot of things are in place to get over that. I'm curious to see, I love our forecast, but I'm curious to see too what happens with consumers if there is a little bit more of a sort of spike and plateau. If you see these pockets where for a year or a month or so, consumers just start jumping on because they get comfortable. You get a group of consumers that says, okay, now I get it. I'm in, and they make the transition, and then another group is still slow. So we could see a lot of variability, I think, in the way that consumers pull on that, and taking the fuel economy standards and some of the regulations back enables consumers to allow for their experience. driving what they have to choose from and what they buy. I think the demand for electric vehicles continues to grow. It does slow it down a little bit. That's what regulations have that capability to do, is push things faster. So we'll see change in that.
Greatly put, Stephanie. Much appreciate. Thank you for that comment. And very important to remember that it will be very fluid as we're talking about electrification, and will certainly be a bumpy road, peaks and plateaus. Appreciate that. And Pete, if we take a step backwards and start to think about the economic side of the business, and particularly thinking about some of the tax cuts that are coming into place, and the fact that we will see economic acceleration in the short term, any concerns on inflationary pressures and how a higher inflation would translate into higher financing rates and affect vehicle affordability and demand for particularly BEVs? How do you see this playing out with the consumer and the mindset of new vehicle purchases?
Yeah, I think that's a very intricate question, I would say, because it touches on a wide range of policies and policy assumptions that are still not fully baked into the forecast, because candidate Trump has proposed a variety of consumer-facing tax cuts, right? The popular slogans: no tax on tip, no tax on overtime, Social Security benefits. He also is proposing to roll back one of the signatures of his first Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2018, which was the cap he placed on state and local tax deductions, capping that at $10,000, which was really an affront to high tax blue states like California, New Jersey, New York that didn't swing for him in the 2016 election. And he's also proposed varying degrees of corporate tax cuts, again, on top of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that passed in 2018, going from a 21% rate to 20, or even as low as 15% during the campaign trail. So it's trying to determine what policies and to what extent they'll actually be passed. I think there's a great likelihood that the second Trump administration will be able to get a lot of this agenda through. There are, to varying degrees, depending on how the cabinet is finally fleshed out, strong majorities in both House and Senate. So passing a revision to the tax bill and tax code does seem feasible and is really high on his priority list. Those tax cuts, unfortunately, at least the lens I view them through, are all tend to be inflationary, and in the end, they all stimulate aggregate demand. So if you think about consumer tax cuts, that gives them more money for consumption, a higher disposable income, higher demand for goods and services and services in particular, which is where the U.S. economy still hasn't seen a kind of a normalized return to inflation, would be pretty inflationary. From the corporate side, right? Corporate tax cuts boost after-tax profits. That could boost stock prices, creating a wealth effect, freeing up more capital to spend as well. So again, all moving aggregate demand upwards. The natural response for that, again, would be interest rates not necessarily migrating higher again, like we saw over the course of 2020 to 2022, when supply crisis and COVID disruptions really caused runaway inflation. This would be more systematic in its approach, more manageable, I would say. So we wouldn't see interest rate increases, but the pace of Federal Reserve easing would likely slow here. So by the end of the forecast cycle, interest rates would still be higher in a Trump environment than it would have in the pre-election baseline. The full suite of those policies was passed. And that's really where the concern for affordability is. We've had several years here of low, I would say, real wage growth. So taming inflation has allowed consumers to see real wage gains, even as the pace of nominal pay increases has decelerated from the post-pandemic highs. To the extent that those tax cuts increase wages and real growth here faster than inflation, we could see a benefit in the short term. But the big concern, again, what happens to consumer borrowing costs? Interest rates have risen for consumers since the election. And really, it's not the Fed policy rate, the federal funds rate, that is critical in setting auto consumer lending rates. That's more determined by the longer-term treasuries, particularly the 10-year treasury yield. And what we've seen is concerns over some of these policies from investors in the bond market that not only would be inflationary, but they'd also exacerbate some of the tensions we're seeing with the federal budget deficit and our long-term debt sustainability. So to the extent that some of these tax cuts are unfunded, and the proposal, again, if we circle back to your first question, Trump is proposing to offset these tax cuts with tariffs. To the extent that he's unable to do that and the revenues don't align, this would increase pressure on our longer-term borrowing costs, and we'd see interest rates for consumers, at least for auto lending, begin to possibly migrate higher, which would limit demand in the long term.
Thank you, Pete. Much to come when it comes to policy. And when talking about policy, definitely, the Inflation Reduction Act includes incentives that help to make EVs more affordable, such as the leasing loophole. If these incentives are targeted either for reduction or elimination, how do you see this playing out with the consumer when it comes to the purchase or lease of EVs?
Certainly, if you take away a potential $7,500 credit, you make it more expensive. You make it more difficult. There isn't a simpler way to say that. But it'll be interesting as things come together and we look at what EV natural demand really might be. The incentives were supposed to sunset in 2032, and ultimately you do want a market where you don't require a $7,500 tax credit to get people to buy the vehicle. But Americans also tend to respond to things like incentives and sales and that. So I think there's also an element where there's some of the EV demand right now and some of the sales we're seeing right now is people are comfortable. Whether they need the $7,500 tax credit or not isn't necessarily always the case. But you're like, if I can get this discount, then I'm more likely to consider the vehicle. That change in thought process, I think, is another element that could play into this. If you're like, I'm on the fence, but I can get a huge discount, so I'll look into it, and that discount is gone, some people may be a little bit more hesitant, regardless of whether they can afford it with or without. And you do have the secondary aspect that you do have consumers at different income brackets that needed that in order to make the stretch to the electric vehicle that they wanted to try. So they'll certainly have an impact. I think another element for the leasing loophole, though, is it was whatever tax laws like this are created, there's always some sort of unexpected or indirect element that sort of sneaks through. And I think this is one of them. I think that with the Inflation Reduction Act, the real core of that bill was really trying to get a North American supply chain and really trying to push manufacturing here. And the leasing loophole sort of negated part of that by making it available on vehicles that weren't produced here. It made it much easier, which works a little bit, but it also is in a little bit of contradiction to what the bill seemed to really want to be trying to accomplish. So I'm not surprised to see that it might be pulled away. It will affect vehicle affordability, but I also think that it will affect the lens with which consumers look at, do I try this change right now or do I wait?
Thank you, Stephanie. Great inputs right there in regards to both consumer and manufacturer incentives. And as we talk about the supply chain and implications on the manufacturing side, Michael, given that some of the automakers have already adjusted their strategies in response to potential deregulation, how do you think the automotive industry will prioritize electric vehicle production and sales without seeing regulatory pressure?
Guido, thanks for the opportunity to have this discussion today. I would think both Stephanie and Peter outlined a lot of different concepts. And again, in the end, the vehicle manufacturers and then in turn the suppliers have to react to those decisions. As we go forward, one would expect even more delays in battery electric vehicle startups, whether new vehicles or new facilities or converting existing ICE or internal combustion engine facilities over to battery electric facilities. All those decisions are really up for discussion. And I think we've seen even before the administration is empowered by mid-January, you're starting to see vehicle manufacturers start to make some moves where maybe some battery plants are shelved and or sold off, or reprioritization of what we call PSD, propulsion system design. In other words, What are they going to do with an existing vehicle? Are they going to continue to have it ICE with start stop? Are they going to add some hybrid? And what are the timing of the different battery electric platforms? So suffice to say, this works its way all the way through the supply chain. And not only the critical mineral supply chain that was discussed earlier, but think about also other aspects of the supply chain, those that supply steering and interiors and interior content, instrument panels, basically throughout the entire vehicle. It does have an impact on the supply chains. Look for the vehicle manufacturers to continue to delay some of those programs and or rescope programs, or even in some cases, cancel programs and wait for the market to have more of a natural demand, which is, again, what both Peter and Stephanie were alluding to, is that kind of as the legislation falls away, what happens to the natural demand of the market.
Thank you, Michael. And let me latch on to last statement you made, delay and de-scope. There's no question about the fact that the policy changes that are about to come on January 21st are going to be significant. And needless to say, we're starting to look at the OEMs pivoting. But as you mentioned, it's still at a discussion stage. Let's talk about the automotive industry in North America in 2025. Will the tax cuts, interest rates, and trade policies impact EV adoption and vehicle affordability at next year? And how do we see that playing out?
Well, I think it was already alluded to, but number one on the runway is definitely if the incentive of 7,500 goes away, whether it's on the critical mineral or the battery side, that is absolutely got to have an impact, especially in the mass market where the vehicle manufacturers were using that as an additional way to get consumers into those vehicles. So that's going to be number one. That is definitely going to have an impact. Stephanie had alluded to the leasing loophole, which again allows for more premium players that might import a premium battery electric vehicle to have a considerable incentive. If that goes away, that will also have a significant impact on the market. So just those two in itself is going to change the PSD or the propulsion system design mix. What are some of the other aspects for more of the overall market? Certainly all the discussion that Peter had with respect to tariffs. And again, I think it's important. We could sit here and talk about a 25% tariff, but I've spoken to a number of different suppliers. And then if a 25% tariff is placed on, let's say, components that they're building in Mexico or Canada and shipped into the United States, and the vehicle manufacturers are basically saying that's on you to compensate for, that's going to be a no-go. There's going to be several force majeure situations and where you have a vehicle with literally thousands of parts. If many of them, or even some of them, are not going to make it over the border, you are not building vehicles. So I think that there'll be some consideration in the automotive industry that 25% tariff is really more of a leverage to gain some other means for the administration, but in some respects, almost to a point of impractical and not really realistic. So we'll have to see how all that works. So you've got the tariff situation, the incentive situation, and it's suffice to say, if we do have some level of tariffs, even if they're more targeted, Peter was very accurate in saying they were just going to drive import inflation and or labor inflation in the United States if, in fact, we have greater demand for labor in the United States. So both of those are going to add inflationary pressures, which would slow the Fed in terms of bringing interest rates down, which would again improve affordability. So it's certainly everything's interconnected. So you have the trade, you have the incentives, you have the interest rates, and then the general pace of the economy is also going to drive how much activity there will be in terms of new vehicle sales.
And that's a wonderful point, Michael. Let's think about this on a global scale. And much of what you're mentioning for North America holds true for Europe today, as we're starting to see trade disruptions come down that way as well. With some countries suspending EV incentives, how do we see the EV growth moving along in Europe in 2025?
Certainly, the legislation certainly drives a lot of that movement in Europe. And if we find the EU is slowing down in terms of their implementation of the legislation, but also various countries have pulled back on their incentivization of battery electric, whether it be Germany or France or the UK or whoever it might be, or there are aspects which could change in the future. That is absolutely, as I just mentioned in the United States, is going to have a significant impact on the market in terms of the European market. And then you have an interconnection of, if there's scale for battery electric vehicles in Europe, then that brings down the cost, and therefore they're more competitive on an export market in a US or other markets globally. But if in fact that scale is a bit more difficult in the European market, that's going to also reduce competitiveness in export markets. So again, that interconnection and the pace of growth in the European market is going to be critical. And again, from our perspective, we are looking at that and continuing to review that. And chances are that we're going to have to pull back again, not only because the consumer's not willing to purchase those vehicles, maybe because of affordability and lack of incentives, but also the vehicle manufacturers from a financial perspective are also backtracking a little bit and saying, okay, listen, I can't risk to put billions of dollars in new investments out there and just wait many years for them to come to fruition. This is a high fixed cost industry, and we really need to make sure that our return on investment is immediate and strong, given the financial situation that many of these OEMs find themselves in, with a China market, which is not as receptive for Western vehicles. You've got import and export that we've been talking about earlier, where it's going to be more difficult to import vehicles, so therefore export demand is going to go down. So all these factors, I think, are critical.
Great points, Michael. And let's continue heading out east and particularly focus on a market that's bucking the trend. Let's talk about China. And there seems to be no question about the fact that these are doing well in China, but it's also important to highlight that it is being dominated by local players. How do you see this shift playing out with all of the Western automakers that are currently in China?
Yeah, I think it's critical. The Western OEMs are facing a myriad of issues in China, whether it be in terms of the payback on their existing production facilities, strong competition in the middle of the market from some gaining and already established Chinese OEMs like a BYD or Li Auto or NIO or others like Xiaopeng. All these are really, and those same OEMs I just mentioned, the Chinese manufacturers, OEMs, are exporting as well. So they not only have domestic demand, but they're beginning to export to a lot of the same markets that the Western OEMs were already exporting to, whether it be South America or Southeast Asia or Middle East or the like. So again, it's kind of a two-pronged approach where as the Chinese OEMs become stronger in their own domestic market, that also drives the Western OEMs to have more problems in China from a profitability and a scale perspective, have to continue to revert and put more effort in their domestic markets, whether it be a Europe or a North America. And then with that, even the Chinese OEMs are continuing to be even more competitive on an export market. So we're finding that there's issues on several fronts. And there's really not much slowing down the Chinese domestic manufacturers right now. The government is allowing and enabling some of that growth. That would be number one. But number two, we're also seeing growth from an export perspective, and that helps their scale economies as well.
Lastly, Michael, given these global trends, how do you think the competitive landscape will evolve for electric vehicles? And we've spoken about some of the clouds out there, but what are the opportunities that automakers have to stay competitive in this changing geopolitical environment?
A lot of them are already pulling on levers that are well known. They're looking at delaying programs or delaying investments. They're rescoping investments. They're looking at joint ventures. So we've seen GM and Honda. We've seen GM and Hyundai. We've seen Ford and Volkswagen. We see potential for Nissan and Honda to have discussions. So again, what you're finding is that there is some strength in a grouping together with another OEM that has maybe some adjoining technology, but also helps with scale. So we're going to see more joint ventures. But anybody who stands here and thinks that the status quo is going to stay would be foolish. I think we've seen that the China OEMs, there are going to be some positive stories and maybe not so positive stories, but they'll continue to move forward. They're moving with incredible speed. And they also have critical minerals and other technologies that in some respects are ahead of the Western OEMs, at least from a cost perspective. And they're going to use that leverage to continue to grow their share, not only in China, but also in export markets as well. So I think it's going to be a much more difficult environment. It already has been difficult, but it'll continue to be difficult for Western OEMs. We're already starting to see that bear out in terms of profitability and long-term viability of some Western OEMs. And this is a story that is continuing to be written and has many more chapters to it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter, Stephanie, and Michael, for these critical updates on this shifting landscape. Automakers clearly have a lot to plan for in 2025 and beyond as they prepare for potential disruptions. Thank you to everyone listening on this month's episode. I want to wish you a prosperous and blessed 2025. Please share this podcast link with colleagues and in your social media accounts whenever you can. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn at SMP Global Mobility and explore our product and offerings at spglobal.com/mobility. We'll be back for more Fuel for Thought next month. Have a great day.